You should be able to see my screen now. So here we go. So the second topic for today is dose metrics. So we started off talking about how image quality impacts dose. You can see here I changed the equation. I did a little bit of algebra and I just moved dose from down here in the denominator over. And now you can see the same effect, but now from the other side of the equation. If you want to reduce noise by 30%, it requires you to double your dose, double the radiation dose. So this is that thing I was talking about. Small changes in dose and small changes in noise can have real big impacts in the dose world. So image quality and dose, as we go through this entire process, when we talk about radiation dose and what is the right level of radiation dose, I want you to consider the fact that when it comes to dose reduction, usually the best thing to do to remove noise in the image is not increasing dose. It's using new technology such as deep learning, reconstruction that we just talked about, or other techniques. When we go to each different modality throughout this overall mission, we'll talk about all of those options. But ultimately, I just want to leave in your mind, and I know you know this, but if the image is not as good as you want it to be, oftentimes the answer is not to just turn up the radiation dose. That is usually not the right answer. So before we get too far into this question of dose and what dose metrics we should use for DRLs, let's talk very broadly about radiation dose. In general, should we worry about radiation? And really, I will answer that question with another question. What are the known risks from radiation? So we all know, in general, that there is a certain level of radiation that will affect our bodies. And so if we expose our body to a certain level, the quasi-threshold, then we will see effects to our tissue. And this is something that we see in the interventional world, in the cath lab and in the IR world, where at a certain level, usually 2 to 3 gray, we'll see hair loss and erythema, epilation and erythema, and the reddening of the skin. If it's lower on the radiation scale, oftentimes the effect is transient and it'll go away. It's not permanent. But the higher the dose, the higher the effect, or the greater the effect. And so it can become eventually permanent or even life-threatening if it's really, really high. We see this typically only in the high, quote-unquote, dose procedures, such as IR, cath lab, and in some cases for CT. But for the most part, in general imaging, when we talk about diagnostic radiology and DR, CR, in most CT scans and in nuclear medicine, we do not see tissue effects from radiation. So that's fine. Why is that? And the answer is because the body has an amazing ability to heal itself when it's exposed to various different effects such as radiation or ionizing radiation. We call this the dose rate effect. And so in a study where they looked at individuals that were exposed instantaneously to high levels of radiation from the atomic bombs from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they looked at how that compared to people that went in for interventional procedures over the course of multiple years. And so you can see here at the exact same dose point. So at maybe 1,000 or 2,000 millisieverts, the effect was very different. And so if someone went in for multiple different interventional procedures at relatively low doses with time, the body was able to heal itself in between each of those exposure events compared to the instantaneous. And so we know that the body can generally heal itself from radiation, which is what we call the dose rate effect. So tissue effects are very well understood when we talk about radiation. what most people are concerned about when they think about radiation is they think about cancer. So what do we know about cancer induction from radiation exposure? Well, once again, from the epidemiological studies, from the studying of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and all of the population that survived that exposure, we've learned several truths. We know, relatively speaking, younger patients or pediatric kids have a higher, about 10 to 15% higher risk than adults. So that kind of makes sense, right? Children are younger, their bodies are still growing and developing, they're still going through ongoing cellular differentiation. Additionally, they will live longer. If an event occurs early in their life that may cause the reaction to eventually mature to cancer, they most likely will live long enough to see that event occur. Whereas if someone in their 60s has a radiological event where they're exposed to radiation that triggers an effect that may cause cancer, there is a chance that that individual will pass away from completely different reasons and never experience the side effects of cancer. So it all really comes down to this idea of latency period. How long does it take for cancer to mature to the point where it becomes lethal? So we know that when you look at the overall absolute effect of cancer, obviously the older population, they are obviously they have more cancer in their population than kids. And that has everything to do with just the ability or the time that it requires for cancer to grow. 3 to 5 years on average for your bloods, like leukemia, 20, 30, maybe even 40 years for solid tumors. These latency periods can be wide and varied and very specific to the type of cancer that we're dealing with. All right. Now, the plot I show here is really, I just simply want to show you, we know that each cancer has its own different effect. So at different levels of radiation exposure, each type of cancer may present itself differently. But in general, the overall trend is always the same, that the elderly population tend to have more cancer than the pediatric population, even though the pediatric population does tend to have a slightly higher risk factor. So what we know about risk from radiation exposure comes from, of course, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the atomic bomb survivors. And this is a region of knowledge that we define and we know very well. It's the higher dose levels. And because we know that real well, we can then project that risk and we can try to make an educated guess of how or what kind of risk we would experience at lower exposure levels. So we know when you look at the data from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that roughly around the 100 millisievert range, that is kind of the point where after that, dose and risk are linear. So the higher the dose, the greater the risk for cancer induction. But the reality is, we're down here. This is where we are in radiology. So when you take, on average, a PET CT scan, which tends to be one of the higher exposure rate events in medicine, we're talking about 10 millisieverts. So we're talking about a tenth of this level that we know can cause radiation. An abdominal CT is about 5, a chest CT is about 1 millisievert. So now we're talking about 100th of the level. An abdominal X-ray, just a planar X-ray, is 0.1. So now it's about 1,000th of the level. And then, of course, just a single view chest X-ray is 0.01 on average millisieverts. So we're talking 10,000th of the level of the known area of risk. So what does this mean? So we know that exposure for medical imaging is relatively low. And so we can also conclude that the risk of cancer induction from imaging is also relatively low. It's very difficult, though, to define or calculate what is the risk from imaging. And that is because of the things we talked about. The fact that there is a latent period from which cancer may be induced before it manifests. And there are a lot of confounding variables that we cannot rule out when we make our calculation, such as lifestyle. You may go in for a CT scan, but then smoke for the next 20 years, and then you may have lung cancer. Did the CT scan cause that lung cancer, or did smoking cause the lung cancer? We can't rule out either with the basic epidemiological scientific knowledge we have today. So then the real question is, why concern ourselves with collecting and understanding radiation dose from imaging? It's so very low. Well, I hope to answer that question by giving you an example. It's still important for us to consider this. In the US, as an example, our natural background radiation, the amount of radiation we are just exposed to, on average, if you live in the US, every year is 3 millisieverts. Here is a color plot of the US. The areas that are here in red are the areas of higher levels of natural incidence or background radiation, and the levels that are blue are the lowest. I'm over here in Cincinnati. Tanya's over here in Indianapolis. We can kind of throw snowballs at each other if we throw real hard. Generally speaking, the center of the US is where most of the radiation, the background radiation is. And that's because of the tall mountains we have. Those tall mountains obviously put you elevation higher, so you're closer to the cosmic radiation, to space. There's also a lot of natural things such as uranium and thorium that are in mountains. In our area, generally speaking, excuse me, we have to deal a lot with radon gas. Now, everywhere around is lower. So compare that to the average amount of radiation our medical population receives. In the US, it's about 2.6. So on average, about 1-to-1 ratio. So in Thailand, in a publication that came out in 2014, they calculated the natural background radiation for you all. And the average national background radiation in Thailand is 0.3 millisieverts. So it is a factor of 10 lower in Thailand than in the US. So the interesting question then is, if your medical exposure is, let's say, comparable to America, because I don't actually know what yours is, and you guys are still collecting that as you do all your national DRL surveys, but let's assume it's on average about 2.6 millisieverts, just like ours. That would mean your medical exposure rate compared to your background rate is almost a factor of 9 times higher than it is in the US. Now, is that necessarily a bad thing? Not necessarily. Should we worry about radiation? In my professional opinion, no. We should worry more about the benefit that we get from imaging versus the risk that we have from imaging. And so to understand the benefit to risk ratio that we use every day in the hospital, that is why we need to understand how much radiation we use in Thailand when we image. So establishing these DRLs helps us, well, collecting the data helps us understand the magnitude of how much radiation we use in imaging, and then establishing those dose reference levels will help us so that we know that if you're imaged in Bangkok, that you're probably getting about the exact same benefit if you went up to Chiang Rai and you were imaged, or if you went down to Phuket or anywhere else. And anywhere in the country of Thailand, what we're trying to do is we're trying to maximize or to equalize that benefit to risk ratio by establishing national DRLs. To put it another way, looking at this image, what we're trying to do is eliminate these extremes. We're trying to reduce the maximum doses that we see in some centers and actually reduce some of the lower ones. Because some of these lower ones are probably underexposed. Maybe they're okay with that, but probably they might be too low for you as a radiologist to do what you need to do. So the idea of measuring radiation dose isn't necessarily to just remove it because we're afraid of it. It's to use it medically appropriately in order to maximize the benefit to risk ratio. So let's talk about some of the goals that we have for setting up the National Dose Tracking Program in Thailand. And you've been doing this now for several years. So you need to identify and you need to identify the correct dose metrics to track. We need to develop a central repository to collect, to curate, and analyze this data. We need to identify trends and establish the reference levels. And then, probably most importantly, we need to go back and educate. We need to educate the end user, the various different hospitals all over Thailand, and then we need to monitor response. So let's go through each of these 5 steps individually. Obviously, the first is we need to identify the correct dose metric to track. Now, we can approach this in multiple different ways, so we can obviously do questionnaires, we can do surveys, we can do the electronic acquisition that Juraporn showed, where the hospitals upload this data. However we approach this, we need to know what kind of equipment you're using. You know, the manufacturer, is it a GE, is it a Philips scanner? We need to know roughly the year it was built, because this helps us understand the level of technology that scanner has. Does it have the latest and greatest deep learning algorithm, or is it still using older traditional ways to create the image? We need to know what the acquisition techniques or the factors are that created that image. The MA, the KV, exposure time, slice thickness, all of this. We need to understand that. We need to know, to the best that we can, some basic patient demographics. This is hard, because not every image that is acquired will capture the demographics of that patient. So in CT, it's more typical, for example, that we will weigh the patient or we'll know how old they are, and that's how we select the protocol to do the imaging. And now we may do the exact same thing with a DR in a planar film or in mammography, but we don't always collect that data because it's not as central or not as important for the actual procedure. You don't need to know exactly how much a woman weighs when you do her mammography or collect her mammogram. And so collecting as best we can some of these patient demographics helps us so that we can, as I show you later in my talk, how we can start to realize which populations are being affected differently by different dose levels, and of course, ultimately image quality. So there may come a point where you need to be able to integrate not only the dose tracking software, but at some level, maybe the hospital information system or even the radiology information system. And then, of course, we just talked about image quality. Is there a way for us to capture that data too? And I believe that's very important as the next big step. As we collect dose, we also need to collect image quality. So the need to examine, the need to understand, to collect and examine the dose is complicated because every imaging modality has a different geometry. CT spin, obviously DRCR, they're stationary and they're planar. Fluoroscopy is in real time, etc. And so each of these have their own unique dose metrics in which we can use to collect, curate, and analyze how well we use those imaging techniques. Now, when we go over each of these modalities, we'll talk in depth why we should use some of these metrics versus others. and we'll give examples and we'll talk about that. But ultimately, you need to remember this one point. None of these, maybe the nuclear medicine PET one, but most of them do not refer at all to the patient. So just because a patient got scanned, they had a chest CT, and we know what their volume CTDI is and their DLP, that doesn't mean we know what the dose was to that patient. We just know what the dose was in that exam. Now, obviously, nuclear medicine, we're actually injecting a certain amount of radioactivity or radionuclide based on the patient's weight. So you could probably argue that is more patient specific. But for all intents and purposes, all the rest are not patient specific. All right, so let's talk about these quantities. The dose reference level quantities, they must be readily available. So whatever we pick has to be something that all of the scanners can produce. You know, if it's a CT scanner, do they all have volume CTDI and DLP readily available? Is it something that's measurable? If you can't measure that and determine that it's accurate, then it's probably not something we want to use. So for example, you have medical physicists that will go around and verify that the volume CTDI value in a CT scanner is accurate. If you can't measure and determine that it's accurate, when you collect that data, the OAP, is it good? We don't know. And that is why, for example, when we collect dose reference levels, generally speaking, the IAEA and others, they do not recommend us using effective dose. Effective dose does not actually define how much radiation was used in the scan, and it actually is not something you could measure. So the IAEA does recommend for radiographs, for dental units, and mammograms or breast tomosynthesis units, they recommend using air kerma. And so we'll talk about that more when we get to those modalities. Now in mammography and breast tomosynthesis, you could also calculate, for example, mean glandular dose. In fluoroscopy, they talk about, or they recommend using the air kerma reference point, or the air kerma area product, or CAP. In CT, we've talked quite about volume CTDI and DLP. Now this is something that I put here, put it in parentheses, and I put it in italics because it's my recommendation, it's my opinion. It's actually not the IAEA's. And I recommend we use SSDE, or size-specific dose estimate. Now the reason why the IAEA doesn't recommend that is because none of the CT scanners today provide that value. But all of the dose tracking softwares do. So for example, when you guys do eventually install Radiometrics at various different hospitals in Thailand, it collects the CT information and it calculates SSDE for you. We'll talk about this when we get to CT, but as someone that works at a pediatric hospital where we image little neonates all the way up to very large obese patients, size is a very, very important factor to consider, when we talk about radiation dose. And then, of course, when we deal with nuclear medicine and PET, we're dealing with the amount of radionuclide that we inject in the patient. So the radiopharmaceutical, as is measured in either millicuries or megabecquerels per patient weight in kilograms. All right, so once we've identified the correct dose metric, we now need to develop a central repository to collect this data. Now, Duraprone talked quite a bit about this and the various different steps you're going through, setting this up, the different years in which you've established to get a couple of different hospitals in Bangkok, and then now as you go from year to year, how you're expanding this, how you've established the OAP as your central repository. So you guys are very far along in this process. When you look at the various different landscape, and I know, for example, you guys are probably going to get Radiometrics installed hopefully within this year. at multiple institutions. The point here is there are actually quite a few different softwares. There are 17 or more that I'm counted out there. All of them handle CT doses. In other words, they can interface a CT scanner, collect the data from it, and process it and send it to the OAP. Not all of them can do fluoro, mammo, or CRDR. Only about 80% of them can. And even fewer will actually be able to interface and work with nuclear impact. There are a couple of free, you can download these for free options. One is called open source. I just simply give it as an example. It's not the one I prefer, it's just free. It's something you can look at. And, excuse me, not open source, it's called OpenREM. My apologies. It does all of the modalities that you could ever want except for nukes and PET. So you could, as you are waiting for Radiometrics or Bear to be installed, you could even download OpenREM at some hospitals and start playing with that, collecting the data and trying to decide how you want to analyze it. Ultimately, as you get Radiometrics installed, and then as that interfaces with the central server at the OAP, you'll be able to more seamlessly provide all the data for the DRO calculations. All right. Assuming now you have that software installed, and now you've collected that data, before you submit it to the OAP, you need to make sure to verify that data. Because if it's incorrect, well, obviously it skews the results and it just makes the results unanalyzable, makes them poor. So labeling is probably one of your hardest tasks. I know Panrutai has probably dealt with this headache for many years. How do we define what one study is called in one hospital and make sure it's equivalent at a different hospital? Because they have to have the same ID when they get to the OAP, or the system won't know how to process it. Because you don't want a regular routine brain scan or a head scan to come to be labeled as a CTA, or vice versa, have a CTA show up and it was supposed to be a routine brain. The CTDI vol values of those two protocols are going to be different to the point where they would skew your data. And then, of course, you just need to make sure the values are correct. And that goes back to where I said, you know, people like your technologists or your medical physicists, if you have them, they need to make sure that the CTDI vol value is accurate on the scanner and all the other metrics that we'll talk about. All right, so now that we have collected this data off the scanner, it's on the server, we have verified that it's accurate and it's ready to go. A certain basic anonymization typically should happen so we can protect patient privacy. Admittedly, the laws and rules may be slightly different in Thailand than it is in the US, but in the US, for us to export data out of our hospital, basic information such as the name of the patient, their medical record number, all of that has to be anonymized and taken out. I assume that you would probably do the same in Thailand. Admittedly, when you're doing dose reference calculations, you really don't need to know the patient's name. So that kind of stuff can be anonymized and taken away. And once it arrives at the main repository, it's going to collect in a server, and that server then will be accessed by the staff that will look at, collect the data, and make their calculations. And then ultimately that staff will generate the reports, the national levels, and then they can send out other reports to the hospitals, which we'll talk about in a moment. So how do we know what to submit? Typically, we're going to pick the most frequently ordered imaging protocols per modality. So you may pick your top 5 or 10 CT protocols, just the ones that are ubiquitous across all hospitals. Routine chest, routine abdomen pelvis, maybe ruling out trauma or something, whatever it is that is so very routine that you will have a lot of data for. And then once you've picked what is frequently used, you need to develop a standard lexicon. And this is where I mentioned you have to be able to name or associate the names. Now, what I'm not saying is that every hospital has to have the exact same named protocol. That is not true. You can call a routine abdomen pelvis at one hospital slightly different than another one. But if you know that it's a routine abdomen pelvis, you just need to know how to associate the ID that the OAP will provide for you, that standard lexicon, so that the right protocol will be uploaded and sent for calculations. In the US, we have the Radiological Society of North America, or RSNA, and they've come out with what's called the RadLex Playbook. It's a free download. You can go to the website. In fact, back in May of 2019, when we were actually there, we talked quite a bit about this. So that is a great opportunity for you to, an option for you to use. Ultimately, you don't have to do this, but the concept is still true. You need to be able to you need to develop an ID structure so that you can associate the name of the protocol on the CT scanner with the protocol that you're going to analyze for your national reference levels. All right. Collection methodologies are, as Jeroporn talked about, the ideal, most appropriate way to do this is dose repository software. So using Radiometrics as an example, which I know you guys are working with the IAEA to establish and install. But when we were back, actually I think it was in January of 2019, you shared with us that you have made very first initial efforts using simple questionnaires, where you went out and you had your physicists go out and make certain calculations, and you also send out questionnaires to the various different hospitals. And so this is a great way to actually continue or to start the process while you wait for the software. The ICRP, which is the International Committee on Radiological Protection, they have a report 135, that recommends if you're going to use a questionnaire to query at minimum 20 to 30 patients for fluoro and about 20 to 30 patients for fluoro and CT, and a minimum of 50 patients for a mammogram. And when you do this, you also need to query approximately 20 to 30 facilities. And at that, it will set the bare minimum for you to establish national DRLs. Now, it's obviously harder when you have a questionnaire because you're either physically dealing with papers or you're physically dealing with electronic forms. And so it takes people to process this and calculate all this. Ultimately, you want to try to survey a minimum of about 30 to 50% of all the imaging centers in the hospital in Thailand. So when you get the electronic system set up, you really want to grow it and expand it until you're at a minimum of 30 to 50% of all imaging centers. And that will give you a really good national DRL calculation. And when you do this, you need to make sure you evenly distribute your calculations among hospitals. Well, evenly is the wrong word, forgive me. You need to sample the hospitals based on the population that you have. So I give you an example here in the US. We have a variety of academic institutions, hospitals where they do teaching. They're almost always level 1 trauma hospitals. But you can see here, they're a small percentage compared to just the typical community hospital, a hospital that's in the suburbs of whatever city or county or state in Thailand. Most likely you have a lot more community-based hospitals compared to your academic hospitals or your freestanding doctor hospitals, your private centers. But what you need to do is you need to sample evenly through that. So if there's 10% of your population is academic hospitals, you need to make sure you sample at least 10% of those academic hospitals. If 80% of them are these community centers, you need to sample a good large percentage of those so that you can get a good distribution of the Thai population. one thing we've done here in the US is we broke down the regions, we broke down the country based on various different regions. And by no means is this the way you have to do it. I just simply found this picture, this photo online. But you need to come up with a scheme as you figure out the groupings of Thailand. North, south, east, west is the central portion. And as you come up with those different groupings, then once we've collected all this data, the next step here is to actually identify the trends. So maybe the northern states or provinces and the southern provinces may have different dose levels than, say, the central or the province with Bangkok. So the most common metrics, we've established that DRLs are going to be collected for the most common metrics. And what we're going to now do is we're going to calculate the 75th percentile of the median dose. Now, we'll get into more detail next week when we go actually calculate DRLs, but just understand that when you do statistics, when you look at a population, the dose reference level is defined at the 75th percentile, so the third quartile. So when you look at the median distribution of all the doses that come across for, say, a chest radiograph, all of those up to the 75th percentile are considered the dose reference level. Therefore, the upper part, the higher than 75th, the 25% that exceed the dose reference level, are those values that we're going to try to get below the DRL. The DRL is an ongoing process. We alluded to this in our last talk. The idea that when we collect this data, we need to make our calculations and our assessments, and then we need to go back and we need to redo the measurements again. Technology is constantly changing. So as one hospital buys takes an old CT scanner out and puts a new one in, the dose levels will change. Now, we need to make sure they're obviously, the protocols are all optimized as the new systems are installed. But assuming they're optimized, what you'll see as new technology comes in, generally speaking, dose levels will continue to come down. And so generally speaking, the IAEA recommends that you reevaluate your national dose reference levels every 3 to 5 years. And this gives you the opportunity to reassess based on the new technology that will come into your hospitals. Now, there is not a requirement, but it's always good to have a goal. So if the dose reference level is established at the 75th percentile, and you as a hospital have all of your imaging protocols below that dose reference level, that's good. That means you're doing as well or potentially better than 75% of all the hospitals in Thailand. But could you do better? And what we call the achievable dose, or the AD, that is established at the 50th percentile, right smack dab in the middle. So then the question is, if you're below the DRL, are you at or below the 50th percentile? Now, this simply is a goal that has been established to help continually incentivize optimizing image quality and radiation dose usage. You don't necessarily need to be below the 50th percentile or the achievable dose, but it's something that's worth working towards and asking yourself, as a hospital, do I have my image quality optimized properly so that my dose levels are at the minimum of the 75th percentile or potentially at the 50th percentile? Because if you're at the 50th percentile, that means you're doing as well or potentially better than more than half of the imaging facilities in Thailand. All right. So how do we interpret that? I just kind of talked a little bit about this. Generally speaking, the national level, that 75th percentile, it's meant to help us optimize to that point. So technically, if you're below that point, really the most appropriate thing you should be doing is focusing on image quality. If you're above the national DRL, if you're above that 75th percentile, then technically that dose could come down without any penalty to image quality. And so that's one of the first things that you could do if you're a hospital and your dose levels are higher than the 75th percentile. You could technically dial down your dose and know that your dose could come down without any major consequence to image quality. Now, once you're below that 75th percentile, the choice to continue to optimize your dose becomes a question that you as a hospital have to answer. It doesn't become necessarily a national requirement. All right, so the next step is to educate. So you've gone out, you've collected this data, you now have initial dose reference levels for a variety of different modalities and protocols. So you're going to take that data and go back to the hospital, and you're going to demonstrate to them how they perform compared to the national DRL. So this is a plot, an example of my hospital for 10 specific CT scans. And you can see here, this one right here is brain, it's a neuro, and the rest of these are body. You can see I listed them right here. The red line, as it says right here, is my facility median. And then the box is the national level. So once again, as I pointed out, the top of the box is the 75th percentile. The middle box, the middle line in the box is the median. The dot is the mean. And there's subtle differences in the calculation of those. We'll go over those next week. Then the lower part of the box is the 25th percentile, or the first quartile. Obviously, the lowest part is the minimum and the highest part is the maximum. So you can see the distribution of doses in our nation. Now, one of the ways that we calculate this data and then we give it back to the hospital is that it's compared as a function of region. You remember the map of the US, it was broken up into regions. So my doses are going to be compared to my region over in Ohio. So my doses are going to be compared to Tanya's because she's in my region. And we're going to compare it to institutions. She works at a children's hospital. I work at a children's hospital. And you can also compare it by the type of scanner, the protocol, the age, if you provide that, patient weight, patient size, if you provide that, and etc. So the more information you give, the more information can be broken down. And so you can see, generally speaking, at least at our institution, compared to the national average, we're generally lower. That's a good thing, maybe. Maybe, just maybe, some of these are probably too low. I would tell you that since I've started working at Cincinnati Children's in the last 3 years, I've actually increased the dose to some of our protocols because some of these protocols were so low. Radiologists, the first thing they said to me was, "Hi, thanks for working here. These images are horrible." And so sometimes low is not the best way to go. But once again, because they're all below the 75th percentile, as an institution, as a hospital, I have the opportunity now to focus on, is the image quality appropriate for the diagnostic task? I don't have to worry that my doses are too high. They're not above the dose reference level, the DRL. And so that gives me freedom to do more with my work, my protocols. And so as I mentioned, you can break these down. The data that you provide, they are simply a snapshot of the data I send up. And you do not have to do this, but they do this here in the US, is they'll actually rank us. And it's just simply a ranking compared to that group that we're compared to. As I mentioned, I'm compared in the region near Tanya over here in kind of the Midwest. And so our ranking, as you can see here, out of 10 we're 9s and 10s. That means our doses are probably very, very low if we're basically the lowest or near the lowest compared to all the other like hospitals in our region. That's not a requirement per se. Probably the bare minimum is when you establish the national DRLs is to establish these box plots, to establish the dose in which we can compare all of the different hospitals. To set up rankings and stuff may come with time. As Jeraport says, with the idea of establishing regulations for accreditation or for law, maybe that will come with time, but it's not necessarily required initially. All right, so we've taken the data, we've calculated it, we've come up with the DRLs, which you have done in Thailand. Now you've taken that data back to help educate so we can start the most important process of all of this. It's to monitor response. So when you take this data and you go back to the hospital, you show them how they can improve. And you provide them tools, you provide them education on how to improve their dose levels and their image quality. And as you do this, year after year, every 3 to 5 years, as you cycle through this, you will see some magic happen. In an example from the UK, over in Great Britain, they have been doing this since the mid-1980s. So when you look at their most recent 2005 report, compared to 2000, their overall national DRLs went down by 16%. Now, if you compare 2005 to 1980, which is when they basically started reporting this, their national DRLs have decreased by over 50%. And so as they've gone through this cycle, round and around and around, all of these several decades, they have been able to see their national dose reference levels slowly over time decrease. Because as everyone improves, your 75th percentile is obviously going to lower. And that and as long as you're also looking at the image quality, that gives you the opportunity to improve the amount of radiation you use medically for your population. And how we refer to the idea that where your background radiation is so low compared to the amount of medical imaging radiation that you potentially use in Thailand, as time goes on and that medical radiation comes down, that's a win-win for you in Thailand. So going out, just basically we talked about this, comparing publishing these DRLs and then comparing them will also give you the opportunity to compare yourself to other similar countries. So you can compare yourself to the European countries as the UK did. You can compare yourself to the US if you really wanted to. But you more probably appropriately is you can compare yourself to the region that you live there in Indochina, to India, to maybe the various different countries around you, and you can see as a group how you can also continue to improve. And where Thailand is going to probably be a leader in this area, especially in the Indochina Peninsula, you have the opportunity to work with other countries to help them. All right. So in conclusion, we've talked a little bit about dose reference levels. What are they not? Let's just refresh this. What are they not? They are not to be applied to individual patients. So just because an individual got a certain value for their CT scan, we do not go back and compare that to the national reference level. We do not use these as a limit to our patients. There are times when patient exams may exceed a national dose reference level. That's okay. If it is clinically required, it is required. It is okay. And so we want to maintain that understanding that dose reference levels, national reference levels are there as a suggestion and as a guide. They are not meant to prevent the usage of imaging or radiation for imaging. So therefore, they are not to be used punitively or for regulation purposes. That is to say, we're not to say the hospital in Chiang Rai that exceeded dose reference levels needs to be shut down. That's not what it's meant to be. It's meant to be as an incentive. And so it's meant to, and it's not meant to define diagnostic confidence. So just because your values are below the DRL doesn't necessarily mean that they will provide you the proper image quality for the task at hand. You still need to determine and optimize the image quality for whatever protocol you're looking at. If you're looking for coronary arteries, looking for plaque buildup, that's a specific image quality and dose you need. But if you're doing something completely different, then you just need to be able to establish those image quality values as a function of the diagnostic task. And so dose reference levels do not define or establish that. They just give you the confidence that you know as a hospital, your imaging doses are at or below the national level. So what is it? As I just mentioned, it provides a context for you to compare yourself in your doses. It helps you identify trends. And this has been very important for us. When we started this process about a decade ago, we realized the way we imaged our brains, our pediatric brains, they were actually higher than most of the rest of the pediatric brains in the country. And so we realized we needed to take a hard look at the way we did that. So they helped us identify a trend we did not recognize. And then it allowed us to do what's called a root cause analysis. Why is our brain doses high? How can we improve those? And we want to make sure if the dose is too low, is it appropriate? Or if it's too high, why is it high? Sometimes it's required to be high, and sometimes it's okay to be low. But we need to make that determination. So why establish DRLs? They help us to establish and maximize the efficiency of imaging and helps us to optimize patient radiation dose and image quality. Additionally, it will help minimize the radiation dose to our staff. Because ultimately, especially in fluoroscopy, the amount of radiation we use to image a patient has direct effect to us as we work with our patients. And this, of course, I say this a lot because I work with kids all the time. This is so very important, especially for the most vulnerable patients in our population. Pediatrics, of course, because we've already talked about how they have a 10 to 15% increased risk. But there are adults that require frequent imaging. There are people that require frequent medical attention. So we need to be most conscientious for the most vulnerable population, patients in our population. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. So there is a question, very interesting, from Facebook Live. So the question is like nowadays some chest, DR and CR images were performed under AED, but 40% were mobile, like a mobile machine without AED. So the first question is, how is the recommendation for image quality evaluation by technologists?
Okay, so admittedly, we're going to talk about this because we are going to talk about DR and CR and mobile imaging when we get there.
Okay.
So it's kind of hard for me to answer because I have lots of plots and I have lots of calculations we can talk about. But when you talk about that automatic exposure content for a fixed room compared to a mobile room, they're obviously two different things. And so the way we approach that is you need to establish unique protocols or fixed techniques so that you know that one system is performing the same as the other. And so we can compare, make sure all of our mobile units have roughly the same output, but they're going to be different than a fixed room. And it's okay if if they are different. So there are different metrics that we can use, which is, for example, the dose exposure to the detector. That's oftentimes defined as either what's called the exposure index, the EI, or the DI, which is the deviation index. Depending on which vendor you use, they will use either one of those. And that will tell you, the operator, the technologist, how much radiation went through the patient and arrived at the detector. Obviously, the radiation of the detector is what creates the image, and so it's very important that we get that number right. A lot of these units will also, the mobile units, will have what's called a DAP or a CAP unit, which is an ionization unit that is, it's up connected to the collimator head. And so that will actually give you dose to the patient information. And so we can look at both of those values and we can see what is the exposure to the patient. And that is oftentimes what we use to send to the OAP to calculate our national dose reference levels. But to determine the image quality, we can look at the EI value and make sure that, you know, obviously if you see the image and it looks very white, you have underexposed the image. But the metric called the EI value will also tell you that, because it'll, depending on the vendor, might be really, really high. And then you know that your technique factor needs to be adjusted. And depending on how many techniques you have, you know, all different kinds of body parts and different potential clinical indications will mean how many different parameters that you have to adjust. Keeping it as simple as possible, that is difficult at times, helps you to maintain a working protocol list, and that protocol list can then be adjusted as is needed. So you track the DAP or the CAP values for patient dose and send those for the DRLs, and then you adjust or track the EI values, and that's something you do for your own hospital. Admittedly, I did a lot of talking. When we get to the DRCR module session, I'll actually have examples, and we'll talk quite a bit about that.
That sounds good. So this leads to the second question. Is it necessary for those data collecting from the mobile radiographic procedure?
So the answer is, the most important probably would be to start with your fixed rooms. And that's just because the majority of your imaging is in fixed rooms. Mm-hmm. But the question is, who gets most of your mobile imaging? They're the most vulnerable. They're usually the sickest. They're the people that can't come down to the floor and get imaged. They're going to be little babies in the neonate floor, or people in the ER, in the emergency room. So the answer is yes, I would say they're important to track. And the other thing is, in a fixed room, those are actually really easy to they're easier to control, because it's a room. The room doesn't change. When the technologist goes in, a lot of these systems, because they have that auto exposure control that you referred to, the system is pretty smart about getting about the same dose, depending on the size of the patient, but it's usually pretty good about getting the same dose. Whereas a mobile unit requires training from the technologists, because they have to use their skills to set the right KV and MA in time. And so that can change quite a bit. So one technologist can use one technique factor and another technologist can use another. Now, obviously, if you have a list, hopefully that list will help keep the exposure values mostly the same. But mobile units tend to be the most difficult to manage, because everyone's used by a different technologist, and every time you use it, it's almost always a different issue. And when you're doing an emergency room and they call for a chest radiograph stat, you're in, you're imaging, and you're out, and it can be chaotic. And so tracking all of that, about those dose values and the exposure values, is actually very important to help. Admittedly, the dose levels from a mobile unit are one of the lower ones. Is it going to adversely affect your population? Probably not. Compared to a CT scanner, If you overexpose a patient with a CT scanner, that's much higher than if you overexpose someone with a mobile or a digital unit. But like I said, there's a lot of room to improve in mobile units. So we'll talk about that. That's a great question.
Yes. So any more comments? อาจารย์ปาริไทย อาจารย์จิรพร
May I ask Sam that if we are going to do the DIR for pediatrics and manual technique, what you suggest about the number and how to categorize into like a age band or weight band? How do you prefer?
Yeah, and so that obviously comes down to the type of modality. So let's say CT scan. You know, probably I don't know exactly how you do it in Thailand. In the US, we almost always do everything by weight. So someone that's 15 kilos versus 70 kilos is going to have two different exposure techniques. And so we can easily stratify those. And when we look at our overall values, we see very quickly, oh, the little guys, you know, this protocol is producing too much radiation compared to this protocol. If you're not stratifying by weight or age for the head, then size is a great way to do this. And if you're using, for example, Radiometrics or a software, the CT scan will collect that value and it will calculate the size for you. And then that is a very good way. That's, for me, like I said, I believe very strongly in the size specific dose estimate, the SSDE. For kids, that's huge. It's very important. But even for adults too, because not every adult is the exact same size. You know, I'm probably twice the size of both of you, all three of you that I can see. And so my CT dose is going to be a little different than yours. And so you know, like I said, the IAEA does recommend we use volume CTDI and DLP. And that's just because that's where we are technologically speaking. But I would not be surprised as the next report comes out in the next probably 5 years or so, they will but they will recommend SSDE. So that's what I would recommend.
And because this year Thailand is going to do the DIL for plain radiograph again and measure the data will be the CAP, Kerma area product. And they plan also to do in pediatrics. And for adult, if you collect data like 10 to 20 for the standard size, but for pediatric, like a pediatric chest, you have to stratify into like 4 or 5 by weight or by AP diameter or something, and the data will be much more and probably difficult to get the number. What do you suggest?
We do, personally at our hospital, we do 5 stratifications. And that's just because, you know, when your littlest person, say less than 15, 20 kilos, they are small enough that they have to be treated separately. We personally then we do 0 to 15, we do 16 to 30, 31 to 45 kilos, 31 to 70 kilos, and a 70 to 100. I think I got all 5 of them. I might have missed one. But the point here is, why did I do that? One of that was 30 to 70 kilos. No, it was, 16 to 30, 30 to 70. So that's a very large dynamic. But when you look at that patient population and you look at the way the CT scanner operates, so I'm referring to CT, of course, the system doesn't really see a big difference. And that's just because the way the body is structured, when they're that size, the system is able to modulate the dose. And so you could break it up even finer. You could do 30 to 40, 40 to 50, 50 to 60, but you probably wouldn't see any difference. They would all basically be the same average. And so what we did is we collected all this data and we basically plotted it out. And then we That's where we then said, okay, it makes sense to say we're going to collect this data right here, and we're going to define, and then we're going to define that. And so as you collect initial data, maybe from one or two universities and or university hospitals, you will see the distribution. And once you've defined that, then you can take that information and go out and request that information for all of the other hospitals. When it comes to planar radiography, weight isn't, you don't typically weigh a patient. Usually it's divided up by age, maybe as an example. And that's mostly because of, bone ossification. So 0, we'll have to talk very specifically when we get to that, because I don't have the example on the top of my head. But you can break it up by, a couple, like 0 to 1, 1 to, 2 or 3 years old. And then usually after 8 or 9 years old, your bones they're as dense or as ossified as you would be the rest of your adult life. And so you really don't need to differentiate teenagers from adults because they're the same. But that's a great question. So when we get to that, I think it's really important for us to really talk about that in depth, and we can get some examples and we can go through that.
So, any more questions or comments?